The Good Must Remember by David Barber. She was oblivious to the children until a snowball thumped her in the back. "Nazi!" they yelled, and "Get back to Germany!" even though she had fled her home to escape Hitler. This is Greta Stindl, with headscarf and threadbare coat, struggling with bags across a road rutted with ice. It is the winter of 1947, the worst in living memory. Someone standing close might have seen the tears squeezed from her eyes by the bitter wind. They might have noticed how the fluttering strands of hair, once dark and glossy, were infiltrated now with grey. Perhaps they might even have recognized what she had been humming. Last night she went to hear Handel's Messiah in Manchester, and coming home afterwards had glimpsed the men again, waiting in the darkness. As her bus chugged away, she had fancied its lights glinted on metal faces. After her mother died, young Greta went to live with Grandma Brock in Leipzig. She never knew what became of her grandmother during the war, but supposed she was swept into the camps with the rest. What a child could know of terrible secrets she had learned from Grandma Brock.
"I saw a circus today, child. A parade of wagons, all painted. Grandma, like the circus that came the day I was married. Though that had cages. There may even have been a tiger."
Grandma Brock was almost blind, and with guilty fascination Greta had watched those milky eyes in their ceaseless search for clues amongst the shadows.
"I spoke to your grandfather about it, but he never answers."
Greta had never known her grandfather, but her own father was also a musician and away on tour. Her grandmother made her swear not to tell. Such a burden for an anxious child. "If you tell," the old woman had warned, "they will see that I am mad, and the goyim will take you." Greta was too young to know what an institution was, but her grandmother spoke of it as a place of punishment. Once she tested Greta about the faces in the wallpaper and the tiny animals dancing in the hearth.
"Which of them do you like best?"
her grandmother had asked, her expression a mixture of cunning and apprehension.
"I love you, Grandma,"
she had answered, though in truth her grandmother had begun to frighten her. And now she feared the metal men were her own secret madness, inherited at last. She skidded on the icy steps of her front door, then fumbled for keys while they pelted her with snowballs, one a stinging blow to the face. Last week they posted dog dirt through her letterbox, but at least they did not throw stones, and she need not dread the midnight knock of the Shostov. Inside she rested against the door, her heart frantic in her ribcage. She supposed these children had lost fathers to the war, or relatives in the Blitz, and 2 years after the victory there was still not enough food, not enough heat, not enough anything. Her bags had tumbled open, and potatoes and turnips were rolling away down the dim hallway. She had grown up in Germany, where turnip root was fed to cattle. In the kitchen, she unpacked her meager meat ration. Meager, but the same for her as for everyone else. They prided themselves on their fairness. Greta never saw the men in daylight, but these winter afternoons darkened so early, she often had the curtains drawn and the doors locked by 4 o'clock, even though she had witnessed the futility of keys and bolts. When the snow first turned to blizzards, she dragged an armchair into the kitchen, where cooking heated the room, though at night condensation on the window still froze into curled ferns. She was sitting with her knees against the oven for warmth when the electric light went out. Sometimes there were blackouts, and she had learned to keep matches and a candle within reach. By its wavering light, she saw the kitchen door slowly swing open. "You will come with us," said one of the shadowy men. She might have told them that she had done nothing wrong, that they couldn't do this, that she knew her rights, but it was obvious that she must have done. They could, and she had none. In some ways it was a relief. They pushed her into the back of a motor car and one of them filled the darkness beside her, while the other drove them down twisting, icy lanes.
Am I being deported?
She huddled against the door, afraid to look in case she saw metal faces and blank glass eyes. When they did not answer, she asked again if they were sending her back to Germany. "There is no reason to be afraid," said the one in the darkness beside. When they halted, she saw it was an airfield, with a black control tower silhouetted against a pale expanse of snow, one of the many abandoned after the war. Their grass landing strips brought back under the plow, or with concrete runways too expensive to remove, left for a generation of youngsters learning to drive. They sat her at a table in a hut beneath a dim, naked bulb, her breath clouding the air. And when they unwound woolen mufflers and removed hats and coats, their metal faces gleamed in the yellow light.
"Was are you?"
she whispered. She was always afraid, always running, and once again the nightmare had found where she lived.
"Why am I here?"
It seemed they had names. This one thought of itself as Speaker to Life, a boast of aptitude for dealing with flesh. The other worked best with its own kind. The chair creaked as the speaker settled its weight, angling its blank head as if considering. She would learn it prided itself on repertoire of human gestures. "Think of that one as, yes, a technician." The technician wheeled an instrument as big as a cooking stove close to her, the reflections of rows of green and red lights winking on its silver face. "No interference," it confirmed. "You are the only flesh within miles," explained Speaker. "Keep still. Pain is not involved."
"Anxiety," the technician droned. "Curiosity, determination, guilt."
Speaker leaned forward. "Our sort are immune to guilt, but not regret. We were careless with you. Your kind, I mean. Then we discovered our fatal flaw. Flesh tells its own story, while machines cannot. Left to itself, even in intelligence as robust as the technician there will eventually switch itself off." Greta Stendal had been ordered to sit still. Now her legs were stiff with cold, and her fingers white and numb. She was being interrogated by machines, or by men dressed as machines, whichever was less fantastic. "We can program ourselves, but that is the problem, not the solution. It seems we must borrow our meaning from the living." She could almost believe they meant her no harm, though she had witnessed railway officers in Germany being helpful to those on the way to camps, never to return. "Each day you recall your kin are long dead, and that you are powerless in a universe that has no meaning." The machine shook its featureless head. "And still, you do not switch yourself off."
"Uncontrolled cell division," interrupted the technician. "Maternally inherited." "What did it say about my mother?"
"Your mother died prematurely, and unless you come with us, so will you." She shook her head. It made no sense. "The timeline will not miss you. You have no children. Your absence would change nothing." That at least was true, and she had always known it. "We offer you a choice."
"Given the choice, I would choose not to be here."
She was surprised at herself. But the machines, for she could no longer believe otherwise, were not paying attention. The technician had said something about being followed after all. Both machines were on their feet. "Listen, not all machines are the same. Some found meaning in the wars, and always they need new flesh. You should fear these." With a sigh like regret, the technician's equipment shut down. "Run, hide yourself." Outside she hesitated. Even in the dark, the snow made her visible. This was not how you hid from the SS. Here was an air raid shelter, a cellar with a curve of corrugated iron for a roof, and a doorway like an open mouth. She fell down the last step in the blackness, and crawled on bloodied knees into the furthest corner. For a long time she shivered in shuddering waves, then grew drowsy, and it did not seem so bad. As a child, she had brushed her long dark hair until it shone. 100 strokes insisted on by Grandma Brock. But her grandmother was paying no attention to her count, worrying instead about the children in the wallpaper, their faces hard with hatred, and about the metal men who had lost something precious. She was urging Greta to run, but her legs would not move.
Flesh is mainly water. 100 watts of microwaves will raise your body temperature again. Then we can begin.
A light dazzled her, sweeping down to her feet, then back to her face.
I do not see why they chose you, unless it is because your absence would make no difference.
No mistaking this for a man, just a metal torso, scarred by welds and as big as a wardrobe.
Perhaps you will last longer than the others.
Greta's face was growing hot, and she struggled feebly to undo her coat.
We should have kept some of you for breeding. Now we have to keep coming back for flesh that history will not miss.
Machines could choose what to believe, the speaker had said, but vanity of vanities, all choice was vanity, and for machines this knowledge was quicksand.
You have been listening to weaklings like the one I crushed tonight.
Sweat stood on her brow. Good men had died fighting such monsters. I know your sort. It took such effort, but Greta Sindel got to her feet.
Except for death, you are empty. Any world made by God would not allow you. Why don't you switch yourself off?
And, as if she had commanded it, electricity crackled in fat pink arcs from the machine to the metal floor, weaving a bright tracery from the corners of its bodies to the walls and floors. For a moment she was blind to everything else, her nostrils filled with the scorch of hot metal.
They think my sort weak,
the speaker said from the doorway.
And they made the same mistake with flesh.
He let the weapon clatter to the floor, and beckoned her past the smoking machine to shuffle up the steps and out into the snow. It was difficult to tell, but perhaps sunrise was not far off.
Given time, your words might have undone it. But high voltage is quicker.
What happens now?
Return with me to the future. Be cured. Lend us purpose and meaning.
Are there more machines like that one?
They are everywhere.
And your kind?
We keep out of their way.
The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for the good to do nothing.
The machine considered this.
And who are the good?
Enough of running. The good would soon be too busy to worry about switching themselves off. She set out for the tower, walking stiffly, but then with more purpose. After a moment the machine shrugged, in its poor imitation of human ways, and followed her.
Welcome to Utopia Science Fiction, the podcast, the best of both worlds. What do two Jedi poets say when they meet? Metaphors be with you.
I am here with Jonathan S. Today we are discussing science fantasy. We'll start this off with a very brief question. What is science fantasy?
Well, it's either fantasy with a touch of science fiction, or it's science fiction with a touch of fantasy. Orson Scott Card described the difference between science fiction and fantasy as science fiction has metal sheets and rivets, fantasy has trees. But I think that can oversimplify things a little. And there's an assumption that in a setting that has magic that a society living within that world will not develop technology. But sometimes you get some good works and some pretty bad ones, where you have settings with a lot of magic, but also in some fairly advanced technology. One of my favorites is easily The Dark Crystal, because it's definitely a magical fantasy setting, but the Skeksis especially have some really advanced technology that is built on their magic, and they have some sophisticated machinery that they've built to do the things that magic wouldn't allow them to do.
That's a good example.
What are some of your favorite examples?
So when I think of science fantasy, I think of Star Wars. I also think of astrology, but that's a different kind of science fantasy.
Yeah, I tend to think of Star Wars as mostly science fiction, even though physics has no bearing on the space battles in that show or movie.
So I kind of think that, science fantasy is science fiction without the science. That's more of my idea of science fantasy, which is why I classify Star Wars as science fantasy, because it's set in space. But I assure you there's no science in that kind of science fiction.
I would say that's more of soft science fiction, where real-world physics doesn't really apply and they don't really explain the technology. It just exists. But I think it is still science fiction. And I'm not going to get into the pseudoscience explanation for the Force in episode 1, but the way it was originally described is almost science fiction in its execution and concept.
What are some advantages science fantasy has over, say, regular science fiction or soft science fiction and fantasy, or fantasy in general?
Well, over fantasy, it can give your characters a little bit more of an edge in terms of the tools available to them. The Force is a tool that Luke Skywalker can use when the technology fails him. And of course the technology is there to supplement what would be either impossible or weirdly difficult to carry out. Again, in Star Wars, hyperspace travel. You couldn't use the Force to do that. That requires a technology.
So if you're using Star Wars as an example for science fantasy, then you must at least consider it science fantasy.
A little bit. Again, it's the Force that kind of puts it into the fantasy territory. Although I will say one of the stronger scientific aspects is in how they deal with robotics and AI. A lot of the droids are practically designed and very well designed. There's an exploration into how they develop personalities. The reason that R2-D2 has such a quirky personality is that, unlike most other droids, he was never subjected to a memory wipe, which is pretty much standard maintenance on droids in the Star Wars universe. And it's basically to prevent the culmination of experiences from creating robots that are fully sentient, self-aware, and who might consider rebellion against their situation. We also know, thanks to Return of the Jedi, that they can feel pain, which is really horrific when you think about it. That someone programmed these machines to feel actual agonizing pain. That's, of course, the torture scene in Jabba's palace. But I would say a lot of the films that inspired Star Wars, like Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, those would definitely fall under the category of science fantasy.
Good old days. So what makes those science fantasy?
Not only is the science not explained, but it's bad science.
Is it bad science because it was always bad science, or is it bad science because now we know better?
It was bad science because they didn't even look into real science.
Here's a question for you. Where did science fantasy come from? It seems to me it's a relatively newish term.
Yeah, it is relatively new, and I think it's a way to try to distinguish its more categorization. Way, way back, even before Flash Gordon and stuff like that, you basically had fiction and non-fiction. You would have found H.G. Wells and Jules Verne on the same bookshelf as Lord Dunsany, but eventually they started to break apart so that it would be easier for readers to figure out exactly what they were getting when they picked up the book.
So as the field expanded, it broke into more and more subdivisions.
So, what are some science fantasy examples that you really liked?
So when I think of science fantasy, I also go back to like the Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers kinds of things. And I also think of like the work of Edmund Hamilton. I think a lot of some of the older science fiction that you would read in those magazines, like Amazing Stories or Wonder Stories, Wonder Tales, those strike me as more science fantasy now, because they're a lot less heavy on the science. If you need a reason for anything to be the way it is or out of the ordinary, you just use the word radiation. They kind of, skirt the science. They can mention it. They can have logical systems, like fantasy has logical systems within it, but it doesn't actually go back onto hard research.
Yeah, that's true. Although a lot of the early radiation stories were, we know that it can have horrible effects, but we don't know what they are yet. We don't know the full extent of what can happen. So there's a lot of cautionary tales. Godzilla springs immediately to mind.
I was listening to an interview with James Gunn, who is one of the few remaining science fiction writers from the golden age of science fiction, and he was talking about science fiction, and he mentioned early examples of science fiction. He mentioned the Epic of Gilgamesh, thousands and thousands of years ago, as containing some kind of fantasy element. So he mentioned that as a science fiction, and I think I could definitely see it as a science fantasy. So science fantasy and fantasy in general can stretch back to the BC, thousands and thousands of years. So it's been around for a while, under different names.
That's true. When does a story cease to be science fiction and become fantasy?
Let me reverse that. I think it ceases to become fantasy and becomes science fiction when it no longer relies on purely internal laws. When you have actual laws of physics that play an active part in the story. Also, when you bring in starships.
Good point. Although, I think you could still have a very strong fantasy setting and still have starships.
I think I would call that science fantasy, though, at that point in time. There was the Eragon trilogy. And if I remember correctly, even though that's a fantasy universe, they have like the idea of atomic explosions in there, summoning up so much energy that you just kind of explode. So there's that kind of, science. It's never mentioned by name.
Yeah, and the Razak are sort of mentioned as not quite being of that world. So it's implied that they're at least somewhat alien.
I think that I would still classify that as fantasy just because it only kind of somewhat indicates these things, and it mostly sticks to this internal laws of this fantasy world.
What would be the cutoff point for the Utopia Science Fiction magazine when fantasy becomes too strong an element in the story?
I'm more interested in hard science fiction than I am in science fantasy or fantasy itself. I am always making exceptions to the rules that I create, so I wouldn't outlaw science fantasy. I wouldn't even outlaw fantasy, but I think the closer things get to hard science fiction, the more likely they will be to be accepted. So the more they use actual physics, actual, realistic kind of technology. One of the things I'm really interested in seeing that I don't see enough of is explanations of FTL drives. A lot of times people will just say, FTL drive goes faster than light, which is great. But I'd really like to see, an explanation of how these things work, of what science they're using to go faster than the speed of light.
Probably one of the most common fantasy elements in a lot of popular science fiction media would probably be artificial gravity. It is absolutely magic. There's no other way around it. But unfortunately, too often they don't explore how it's possible to expand on the capabilities of an artificial gravity field. But one exception to that would be Larry Niffin's known space universe, the gravity polarizer, which is actually not primarily an artificial gravity system. It's more of a side effect of the Kazinti's propulsion system, which is essentially a reactionless drive, a reactionless engine.
So Larry Niven is actually one of my favorite authors. And as a bit of trivia, just to show that even the great authors are not beyond silly mistakes, if you have the first edition of Ringworld, I think is the story, the first edition that he published, it has the sun on Earth rising in the wrong direction and setting in the wrong direction.
Oops.
But I definitely find that one of the more interesting parts of science fiction in general is just being able to explore the science and the complications, the advantages, the full effect that science can happen. When I do a lot of writing on my own for science fiction, what I'm looking at a lot lately is negative mass, which is not a real thing that we know of. It's a theoretical thing, but it's one way of accomplishing FTL travel and artificial gravity. So I think the takeaway should be this. Science fiction is about reality. It's rooted in science, hard, cold facts. And fantasy is about the opposite. Fantasy is about what's not possible. Science fiction is about what is possible. And science fantasy is the science of what's not possible. And that's all the time we have for today. You've been listening to Utopia Science Fiction, the podcast. Thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to read David Barber's story, What the Good Must Remember, or many other stories like that, please pick up a copy of our latest February issue underneath the Current Issues tab on our website, www.utopiasciencefiction.com. And thank you for all those supporters out there who have helped our magazine grow. If you'd like to help support Utopia Science Fiction, or if you'd like to subscribe to our magazine, please visit our Patreon account at www.patreon.com/Utopia Science Fiction. By subscribing to our Patreon, you gain access to exclusive content, including bloopers we recorded while making this podcast and other amazing and fun things. Don't miss out for as little as $1 a month. You too can become an invaluable supporter of Utopia Science Fiction. It's our supporters who help our magazine run and continue to do great things, like pay our authors and artists, and continue to bring fantastic science fiction stories to you. Please be on the lookout for our next podcast, which will be recorded and released in May. Until we meet again, dear listener, dear reader, remember the bold refrain. Let us push together, onward, ever onward, onward through the impossible.